Hopefully everybody can hear me just fine. Good afternoon. And it's good to spend a little bit of time with you talking about pre-emergence herbicides. I guess in this at this time of the year, you're either already applied your first round and planning on coming in for your second round here a little bit later on, or you're getting ready to apply your first. But nonetheless, I hope that we can share some information with you that will be helpful as the season progresses. Just a quick thing to do real quick for a safety share. I just had to do this myself right before the call. I've been sitting for a long period of time today. So just a quick reminder is if you find yourself in the office on rainy days or, even just riding around a long time in the truck, take some time to take a break, get up, stretch your legs, move around for a little bit. So it's much better to do that and stay active than just remain seated for long periods of time. So give yourself a 15-20 minute break as you're going through the days, if you're having to be sitting for a long time. Okay. As we get into a pre-emergence herbicide, discussing in proper timing of pre-emergence herbicides, you may be asking yourself, well, isn't that pretty self-explanatory? And I guess in some ways it is. But what I want to try to do is walk through a few things to help you understand some of the intricacies of pre-emergence herbicides and in relation to specific emergence of weeds that you may be managing. So pre-emergence herbicides in general, these are herbicides that are applied prior to the emergence of target weed species. Interestingly enough, they don't prevent germination. They simply prevent the target weeds from emerging from the soil. As a matter of fact, if you've ever seen this happen in a greenhouse or bare soil, even make a pre-emergence herbicide application, there are some modes of action that the weed will actually emerge and then die, like something like a triazine herbicide. Very common to see little seedlings emerge, and as soon as they begin to go through photosynthesis, they die out because that's how that mode of action works. But underneath the canopy, a lot of times it's hard to see if you're dealing with a full canopy of turf grass. They tend to be selective, obviously. They target mostly annual grasses and small seeded broadleaf weeds. So things like crabgrass, goosegrass, foxtail species. Then you get into some of the small seeded broadleaf weeds, amaranthus species like pigweeds, spurge, but not all of these weeds are germinating at the same time. So as we get more into the conversation, that's what application timing and why application timing is important. A little diagram to just show you about a pre-emergence herbicide. We talk about setting up a barrier, a herbicide barrier in the soil. Pre-emergence herbicides in general are soil activated. What that means is they need to be incorporated with either irrigation or rainfall after application so that they can move down into that soil profile where these weed seeds are. Because what we want to have happen is once we establish this barrier, they don't move down in the soil very, very deep. I mean, it's going to stay within the first 2 inches of the soil profile. But as these weed seeds, these little white circles here are depicting weed seeds, as they begin to develop and begin to produce the meristematic tissue, those initial root systems are going to hit that treated barrier. And then that's where the active ingredient is going to impact the emergence of that weed. So a lot of you take, for example, dinitroaniline herbicides, something like a prodiamine or a pendimethalin, and even dithiopyr. In that, from that respect, they're mitotic disruptors. They prevent cell division and root elongation. So that's why these weed seeds don't emerge, because they cannot grow past that treated barrier in the soil. Because why is this important ultimately is because we want to, not only do we just want to control the weeds, we want to make sure we have an established turf that will help us outcompete those weeds. If this was your end result, the final product that you produced to your customer, would they be happy with this result? I would say that if you just left it like this, they probably would not be happy with this result. Most of the time, some people may, but in general, they are hiring lawn care companies to help them produce a green, healthy turfgrass stand that they can enjoy during the summer months and throughout the year. So we don't want to just stop by adding a herbicide to the mix to control the weeds. Certainly that's a part of it. And as we get further into it, we can understand why, that herbicides are just a tool of the puzzle that we use. I mentioned earlier, we talk about annual life cycle and annual weeds being the primary types of weeds that are being managed with pre-emergence herbicides. And you have spring and summer annuals, and you have fall annuals or winter annuals. So if you're in the warm season markets in the southeast and southern portions of the United States, you have winter annual weeds that such as annual bluegrass, henbit, chickweed, that germinate in the fall. Probably not going to control those weeds with just a single application of a pre-emergence herbicide in the spring. It's just not going to last that long. So the timing of an application for fall, winter weeds is going to be critical in this situation. Same for, crabgrass and goosegrass or, foxtail type weeds. These are spring or summer weeds. They germinate and emerge in the spring and grow throughout the summer. So we want to try to tackle those timings here. That's why it's important, from an application standpoint to understand, okay, yes, I'm dealing with an annual weed. When does it emerge? And when is a pre-emergence herbicide going to be best utilized to control that weed? Because really in turf management, it's all about breaking weed cycles. And this is a classic example. I had a professor once that would call this the Bermuda Triangle because you have a winter annual in annual bluegrass and a summer annual in goosegrass. You can substitute this for crabgrass if you like. Annual bluegrass is germinates in the fall, like I said earlier, but it dies in the spring. Well, if it's not controlled, voids are left in the turf, and it gives us ample opportunity for that sunlight to penetrate that canopy and stimulate emergence and germination of summer annuals like goosegrass and crabgrass. And so by using all the tools that we have and properly timing our pre-emergence herbicide applications, we can break this cycle to produce a much better product in the long run to the customers that you serve. Of course, there's a lot of different things that go into pre-emergence herbicides and the efficacy that they produce. There's a lot of factors that can influence herbicide efficacy. We have to understand that once that product leaves the nozzles, then essentially it's out of your hands. And that's why it's important to understand, the rate that you need to use, the timing, whether or not this product needs to be incorporated with irrigation or not, because the soil, the type of soil that you have can influence efficacy, the environmental factors, as well as the application method. All of this plays into herbicide influence as far as how that pre-emergence herbicide is activated. You may have seen something like this before, where we talk a lot about herbicide fate or pesticide fate in the environment. Once that product is sprayed and it's incorporated or not, a lot of different processes take place to break that down, or break that active ingredient down, or degrade that molecule. The vast majority of pre-emergence herbicides are degraded by microbial activity. The dinitroanilins is a big group of pre-emergence herbicides that are used out there. Sometimes they refer to these as the yellow herbicides. They are very susceptible to microbial degradation. So if you look at something like this, over time, this is what's happening essentially to your pre-emergence herbicide. How long this degradation occurs or takes depends on a lot of different things: your use rate, soil moisture, temperature, all of that. So, you may have done this in the past, but a lot of times you'll see applicators lead in early spring with a dinitroanilin, something like a prodiamine. And one of the reasons for that is because an early spring application, the microbial population is cooler, the temperatures are cooler, maybe the moisture is not there just yet, so it's going to take it longer to degrade during that time frame, as opposed to when it's warmed up in the spring, you're getting more consistent rainfall. But that can backfire. Say if you get an early spring and all of a sudden that soil temperature increases, you've got the moisture levels and the microbial activity increases, they're going to immediately start feeding on that active ingredient. So it's going to break down a lot more. So that a lot of times is why when we have warm, wet springs early, why we tend to see pre-emergence herbicides not last as long, is because that microbial population became active a lot sooner than expected. So all of that plays into how the long a pre-emergence herbicide is going to last. I mentioned soil factors. pH certainly is a factor. The type of soil is a factor. Typically, your soils with heavier clay content and organic matter content, the pre-emergence herbicides are going to bind tighter to those soils, whereas in a sand, heavier sand-based soil, the active ingredient is going to be more readily available as far as interacting with that pest. So sometimes just what you'll see is it may not take as much active ingredient to control that target weed, but at the same time, on sandier soils, you may have to do multiple applications because you don't have that active ingredient binding as tightly to the soil as, say, in a situation where you have more of a clay or organic matter type soil. pH can have both a positive and a negative effect. It can have an indirect effect on the growth of the turf. Sometimes you'll have the pH impact the solubility of herbicides. which could potentially cause greater injury on the turf and less efficacy. So it's really important to pay attention to what is on the label. So many products are out there that if it's a product that is sensitive to pH, a soil pH, they'll have specific statements of saying, okay, well, this is what you need to do if you have an issue with a pH. And I guess as an aside, and we'll talk a little bit about that, this a little bit later on, but what your tank pH is also important when you're mixing and spraying a herbicide. So I think that's one thing that's often overlooked. That could be an easy fix in a lot of situations. We touched on environmental factors, how much rainfall. If you're getting an excessive amount of rainfall with high temperatures, that certainly can impact the degradation rates of those pre-emergence herbicides. Other areas, situations of wind is more of, is if you get, windy area and you're making applications with a sprayable product and you're getting drift, then you're not getting a full rate of that active ingredient applied to the target area. So those are different situations that can have an impact on efficacy and effectiveness of pre-emergence herbicides. Mixing and calibration, we'll touch a little bit more about this later on, but I think this is a very easy way to make sure that at least your equipment is calibrated and your mixing methods are correct, your calculations are correct. Can save you a lot of time and money if these are checked and double checked. Use rate, sometimes an application may go out at a reduced rate. Well, if we go back to what we talked about with the degradation of a pre-emergence herbicide and the rate of degradation, if you apply less, then that degradation curve is going to be steeper, meaning it's going to take less time for that amount of product to degrade because you don't have as much product in the system. So just things like that need to be taken into consideration. This is a good little picture of a pre-emergence application where the application boom, the spray boom itself, was too low. So again, going back to application technique, mixing and calibrating, is if you use a lot of ride-on sprayers, at the beginning of the season and maybe a couple of checkpoints throughout the season, because you can use these equipment for both pre-emergence and post-emergence applications. But just make sure your spray pattern is where it needs to be, and if any adjustments need to be made. This is it. So you see here, crabgrass, clean turf, crabgrass, clean turf. This could also be a symptom of a clogged nozzle. So checking your equipment, going back to that is very important. It makes you more efficient in your job, and it saves time as far as having to make callbacks and things of that nature. A couple of things to watch out and probably avoid. It might be a good idea to avoid, what we call the major no-no section. A little good, a lot is better. Some people may have heard of the glug method, right? Don't want to do that. It's not good product stewardship. It's not good use of your money. So going back to making sure your calibration rates are effective and double checking equipment is going to be important. But the research that goes into these products, those rates are dialed in to a point where the recommended rates on that label is what's been proven time and time again to be effective. So just make sure that you're being mindful of that and going by what the label says, because there's been a lot of time and effort into understanding and trying to get that rate range right. Rain must have washed it away, so I need to treat again. Well, a lot of times, these pre-emergence herbicides are going to bind fairly tightly to the soil. So Typically, even when you get a really big rain, it's not going to move off site. There are, certainly, some exceptions to that occasionally, but in general, a second application right after the first application is not needed. You know, if you did get a big rain and say you're on just a pure sand soil, then there's options, little strategies that you can attack from a post-emergent standpoint. High spray pressure can control anything. So, a couple of things to be mindful of is, what are you doing when you increase your spray pressure and you're pushing out more water volume? What else are you pushing out? You're pushing out more product. So, by increasing your spray volume, it can very likely be increasing the amount of product that you're applying. So you don't want to get into a situation where you're wasting product or causing unnecessary harm to the turf grass and things of that nature. So again, all going back to calibration and proper calculation of how much product you're using. It's kind of a neat little, I didn't realize this was going to happen, but hey, here we go. I mentioned calibration just then. Well, this was talking about calibration. I calibrated 6 months ago, so I don't want to waste time doing it again. Calibration is an easy way to, keep your equipment up to date. It's an easy way to make sure that your applications are going out effectively. This is it doesn't take a whole lot of time in the grand scheme of things to make sure your crew is trained properly, on a slow day or just a day first thing in the morning or at the end of the day, however you want to structure it. Take the time to calibrate your equipment, make sure everybody knows, what a good spray pattern is. Make sure they know how to calibrate equipment themselves, because this is just a very important part of making effective applications. I would say, calibrate as often as you possibly can, because even down to the formulation, there's certain formulations that are going to spray differently than others. So it may require a little bit more, like a WG formulation may require a little bit more pressure to push it through that system and through those nozzles and screens than a liquid formulation. So never hurts to calibrate. So just keep that in mind. Come up with a plan and strategy that works best for you and your operation as you're moving through the system. We've talked about timing. If you wait too late with a pre-emergence application and that weed gets out of hand, that's already germinated, or if you miss a bigger window, then that product is going to be ineffective. Sometimes pesticide mixtures, you're mixing all this stuff into a tank to save time. Sometimes that can cause issues. So please be familiar with what you're doing. Don't just go willy-nilly and throw a bunch of products in there you've never used before, and go out and spray it. Hopefully you have an area a small area that you can mix up in a backpack or something like that and test a mixture, look for compatibility, and do that before you go full scale. Making sure the products are stored correctly, the labels are up to date, and they're clearly marked. Everybody on your team understands what products are what. There's been too many examples over the years of where somebody has grabbed the wrong herbicide or the wrong product and caused some pretty significant damage. So communication and education are big factors in when you're dealing with herbicide applications. So kind of going back, if you remember that one little picture I showed you of the thin canopy of turf grass. Herbicides are only one piece of the puzzle. Okay, absolutely, pre-emergence herbicides are important, and it can help manage weeds and manage turf successfully. But don't forget about the other parts of managing turf grass: proper fertility, irrigation, mowing. Some of these you may have control of, some of them you may not have control over. But do your best to communicate with your customers about the importance of how all of these work together. Some of you may be managing properties that right behind you, a mowing company is coming. How do you work with them? How do you communicate with them on a daily or weekly basis to let them know, hey, this is St. Augustine grass, and they're scalping St. Augustine grass. Well, what mowing height does St. Augustine grass need to be mowed at? Okay, you're talking 3-4 inches compared to an inch. Huge difference in problems that you would have when you have the incorrect mowing height in this situation. Tire rutting. I'm sure you've probably experienced this where mowing company comes in, or even it doesn't even have to be a mowing company. It could be a homeowner who just says, well, I'm just going to go. This is the only day I have to mow. So I'm just going to go out and mow, and they rut up their yard, and then you come out and you have to manage the weeds in these areas where they've just created these voids in the canopy. And as soon as these areas warm up, what's coming back? It's not going to be the turf grass, most likely. It's going to be more weeds that you're expected to manage. So communicating with your customer to say, hey, let's give this property a little time to dry out before you mow. And I get that it's easier said than done, but the more you communicate and educate, the better. All right, so if we talk about application timing a little bit more, there's a lot of different pre-emergence herbicides out there, whether they be single active ingredients. Some of these are warm season only, others are cool season, or combination products like Echelon, which is both cool and warm season. You've heard a lot of times you have these types of signs that you look for with forsythia blooming. That can be a good indicator of when crabgrass is emerging. Certainly areas that are around curbs or on the edge of the driveways, these areas are going to warm up a lot more, a lot faster than in the middle of the yard. So these could be early signs of emergence. Flower beds. So just paying attention to these two areas may be a good way of tracking emergence in your on your properties. Now, I wouldn't necessarily wait for this situation to develop before applying a pre-emergence herbicide, but I guess what I'm saying is, say for example, if you see, the pre-emergence, the forsythia starting to bloom, and you've timed that around those your pre-emergence herbicides from blooming, those blooms around your applications around that blooming of the forsythia. That's what I'm trying to say. And you've got all your pre-emergence herbicides down. When you're going back and revisiting these sites in areas that you haven't sprayed, like flower beds and things of that nature, keep an eye on, what weeds may be coming up in those areas that you haven't sprayed, to give you a good indication of when those weeds are emerging. Because annual weeds and even perennial weeds, they do have specific soil temperatures that they emerge, and it's not all at once. And we'll talk about that here in a little bit. We talked about lack of pre-emergence herbicide performance a little bit earlier. mainly it's, sometimes you get in a situation where for whatever reason, you didn't make it to that property on time. And so you missed the window of application. So that's what may cause you to have a failure in pre-emergent herbicide, and then automatically throws you into a post-emergent situation. I'm sure a very common example of on the home lawns is not everybody has an irrigation system. And how many times have you gone out and made an application because the forecast has said, oh, we're going to get a 1/4 inch of rain today, and it's cloudy and it may be just drizzling a little bit when you're making that application, and all of a sudden it clears up and it doesn't rain for another 2 weeks. So doing your best to irrigate after application if that property has irrigation, or timing those within, say, a week of rainfall is going to be important. Too much rainfall, again, this is more related to, you get a saturated soil conditions, you get that increase in temperature, the microbial population and activity increases, and that leads to breaking down of that material. Rates too low, we talked about that. Equipment area, application error. Those are all situations where you can see failures or lack of herbicide performance there. This is a good example that I got from Dr. Dave Gardner at Ohio State University. Just showing you that all that can happen, with pre-emergence herbicides once it leaves the nozzle. And basically, you say this is, say, for example, in Ohio, crabgrass germination can happen anywhere from, say, mid-April all the way into, say, the first part of July. Well, with your application timings from a pre-emergent standpoint, you at least want to be making sure that you're using a rate that's going to cover that window of germination. Because over time, that product's going to continue to degrade and break down. And this right here is basically the threshold for minimum amount of control. That's the amount of active ingredient that has to be in the soil remaining for it to still be effective for the rest of the season. But thatch and weather and rate are going to have an impact on that. So, to continue using the example of increased soil moisture and microbial degradation, say you use a lower rate, and then you come across a location that has a very thatchy yard, well, this curve may be steeper, because typically the more thatch, the higher the microbial population and organic matter in that matter. So it's going to be bound up tighter and broken down faster. So that level is going to degrade faster in this particular situation. So be mindful of those situations as you're talking about application timing specific to the weed that you're trying to manage, because there's a lot of different weed species out there that germinate at different timings. This gives you an example of different weeds. This is soil temperature at 2 inches in different weed species. And if you think of this, not necessarily in months, but cooler parts of the year, going out through the summer and into the fall, this is kind of an example of what you'll see. So prostrate knotweed and Japanese stilt grass tend to germinate before crabgrass. Yellow nut sedge is in the 60 to 65 degree temperature range, and then so forth and so on until you start to get into the winter annuals in the fall, where temperatures start to drop back down below 70 degrees. At FMC, we've done a lot of work with yellow nut sedge, and a great example of application timing is with a product we have with Echelon. And that we know that, if we apply Echelon, say here, before crabgrass germinates, typically crabgrass is going to germinate when soil temperatures are consistently in at 55 to 58 degree range, soil temperature 2 inches. So when we make an echelon application here, we can get good crabgrass control, effective crabgrass control, and get yellow nut sedge control. But we get much better control of yellow nut sedge if we time that application closer to yellow nut sedge emergence. And it is really interesting, almost night and day. The value there, is still good control when you apply it here, but even better here. So if yellow nut sedge is a big issue for you, a strategy may look like something to where you come in initially with a pre-emergent herbicide for crabgrass, and then come back with a second application of echelon to extend that residual crabgrass control, but specifically target yellow nut sedge emergence and apply it just prior to emergence. So really good example of that as far as why application timing is important. I think another example would be, how do you manage Japanese stiltgrass and crabgrass? Well, I mean, pre-emergence Japanese stiltgrass has to be back here. This can be challenging especially if we have a prolonged winter. If you're in an area where, say in the Northeast or the Midwest, and like the gentleman or the person said in Chicago, if you still have snow on the ground, it may be challenging to make an application soon enough to target these 50-degree soils. Now, hopefully, the other situation is not hopefully, but the other situation is even if you don't have snow on the ground and you reach these soil temperatures, if you're using ride-on sprayers, you don't want to get out there and rut up the properties. So just being mindful of those things that can be challenging as far as applications go. Some people will ask a lot about single versus sequential applications, and it really depends on your geography. If you're in the upper Midwest or New England, you may be able to survive with just one application simply because of the growing season is not as long. But if you're in the Southeast or in Southern Florida, you may need multiple applications, sometimes 2, 3, 4 applications in a season, depending upon where you are geographically. Also depends on what types of weeds you're dealing with. Whether you're dealing with just annual grasses that all pretty much that germinate, say, in between those soil temperatures of 55 to 65 degrees, or if you have a big issue with summer annual broadleaf weeds like spurge, which germinates a lot later. So does it make sense on those properties? If you have let's say one route that has just a bunch of crabgrass and spurge, how do you manage that? Does it make sense to do sequential applications in those situations? And there are certainly advantages of certain products, pre-crabgrass and early post-crabgrass. We talked about dithiopyr, another product, Echelon, I mentioned earlier, is going to provide early crabgrass, early post-crabgrass, as well as free yellow nut sedge, and has goosegrass control. So depending upon what your needs are, may impact and influence, whether or not you need sequential or single applications. Always making sure that you understand what the product does before you get out and start using it. That helps. That comes with reading the label, reaching out to your local university people, distributor reps, anything that you can find to educate yourself about what product is going to be best for you. It's going to be important. You don't want to run into a situation where you start to cause turf injury. This is an example of club rooting from a particular product. This is actually a symptom of a mitotic disruptor that's not properly timed, that is. Making sure you're making those applications before the weeds emerge, it's going to be very important, as we've discussed, and then using products, of course, that are registered for turf grass. Okay.
Ken, we'd really like to thank you for great educational presentation here. And thank you to our attendees for participating in First Friday. And we will see you next month.
Thank you. Great presentation.